Friends, hello and welcome to Reading Theologically, a spin-off episode of our traditional podcast, Leading Theologically. My name is Bill Davis. I serve as the Senior Director of Theological Education Funds Development at the Presbyterian Foundation. And today I am joined by Professor William Yoo. Dr. Yoo, welcome.
Oh, thank you, Bill. It is a delight to be here with you.
Friends, Dr. Yoo serves at Columbia Theological Seminary as the Associate Professor of American Religious and Cultural History. He has published books on African American Christianity, Asian American Christianity, Presbyterian history, and the histories of indigenous rights activism and abolitionism in the United States. His book, What Kind of Christianity? A History of Slavery and Anti-Black Racism in the Presbyterian Church, received the 2023 Award of Excellence from the Religion Communicators Council. Dr. Yoo, what a great historian you are, and I am so privileged to be having this conversation with you today, where we talk about your newest book that is dropping today, as our listeners are listening to this, Reckoning with History, Settler Colonialism, Slavery, and the Making of American Christianity. And I know if it's anything, well, I've read it, so I can tell our listeners we are in for a treat, not only in this conversation, but as we engage with this newest book that you've written. Can you go ahead and give us an overview of the book that you've written and what drew you to study this topic?
Oh, sure. First, Reverend Davis, I'll call you Bill. Feel free to call me William.
Please.
Yep. I just want to thank you for all of the work that you are doing to support theological education in the PCUSA, but also congregational ministry and public theology across our denomination, all our congregations, and the wider church in the world.
Well,
I just want to thank you for inviting folks like me to talk with you about good, hard, challenging, deep, and ultimately inspiring and actionable topics. And that is what I hope for this new book that I wrote. In some ways, it is simply a history of Christianity in the United States. The making of the content and context of Christianity and how it came to be. I think perhaps one analogy I'll use, Bill, is when children ask us, where do babies come from? For the longest time, right, Bill? Historically, there's that, I don't know in 2025. I don't even know if my kids know the stork analogy, but that's what you thought of. That's what I thought of, right? When a person or two people who love one another and want a child, a big bird comes to your house with a white blanket and a baby appears at the doorstep. And part of the reason why this is told is because the actual answer is complicated and messy and complex. And in some ways, it's a little bit much for a 5-year-old or 8-year-old.
Right. And I imagine not always developmentally appropriate, right? We tell these myth narratives until we're ready to grapple with the history and the truth, right?
Yeah, I agree with you, Bill. And so I think I thought of writing a book while it is, in some ways it is parallel, Bill, to understanding U.S. history writ large, or broadly speaking, nation building and nation making. It is about the advances, the ideals, the beauty, but also the brokenness and the contradictions and the compromises in which the United States as a nation came to be. In some ways, it was the best of democracy. And in other ways, what we do know and what is taught in history classes, perhaps in middle school and high school, when it is developmentally appropriate, is that it was messy and that it did involve sometimes unjust engagements with indigenous peoples and various indigenous nations. And it did involve the inheritance of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery, first in the colonies and then in the United States. So that's how we tell and understand the story of American history
Mm,
in ways that I don't think need to be destructive and fatalistic,
mhm,
but in ways, Bill, that need to be honest and
mm.
in ways that are, in some ways, inspiring
Yeah,
because it is what was is not what has to be what is and what will be.
yeah,
Can we hold on to the ideals of democracy while repenting of and repairing some of the sins and the mistakes of not following out and living out that democracy?
mm,
So, similar, Bill,
yep,
the story I tell is
mm,
about American Christianity.
yeah,
Again, the content and context of how Christianity came to be. And in some ways, I found many awe inspiring accounts of
mm,
indigenous rights activism,
yep,
such as the broad coalition and movement to oppose the expulsion of Cherokee and other indigenous nations
yep,
in the state where I currently reside,
mm,
Georgia,
yeah,
and other states nearby.
yep,
And again, the abolitionist movement.
mm,
And Bill, I know you've read it. I think one of my arguments is
yeah,
that I don't mean to say that the abolitionist movement was entirely a Christian movement,
yep,
but many Christians were deeply involved in the movement and
yep,
found inspiration and found the reason for their movement was God's goodness and God's
right,
love and God's truth as
yep,
revealed in the scripture and other theological resources, such as the early modern Protestant Reformation,
mm,
appeals to Martin Luther and John Knox and John
mm,
Calvin
mm,
and the like. And so that's the story I want to tell.
hmm,
It's messy and it's
yep,
complicated. There
yep,
was severe injustice,
yeah,
and there were those who were seeking to enact justice and resist all of the bad that was happening. So I
yeah.
hope that, yeah.
No, William, I definitely think that came across like as reading those early chapters at times as you're going through that fraught history, I found myself as a fairly privileged white male weeping at the injustice that folk like me perpetrated onto others. Right. Yet at the same times as you move towards that hope, there was some rejoicing there that it wasn't all fraught injustice, right? There were things that you highlight so beautifully where people were working against the systems of injustice in their day because of their faith, because of the religious communities that they were a part of. So, William, I wonder as you dove so much into this history, as you research these churches in the 20th century and 19th century and their involvement with slavery, what surprised you the most about that history that you were uncovering?
Oh, yeah. Thanks, Bill, for the question. Um, So one thing I do want to not put a pin in forever or anything, but Bill, I do want to engage and ask you some
Yeah.
about um, what it was like for you reading
Mm,
my book in
yeah.
your social and racial context and location.
Yeah.
'Cause I do think
Yep.
it is haunting and it is
Yes.
sobering, not
Yes.
unlike it is when I think uh, all people, particularly white people, for
Yep.
example,
Yep.
visit Montgomery and
Yes.
Selma, these in
Yep.
Alabama, and see the
Yes.
Civil Rights
Yes.
Museum, and this is a later
Yes.
history,
Yep.
or see the Trail of Tears in the
Yep.
19th century and see the images, and it is haunting
It
to
it is.
wrestle with
And so,
that.
yeah, so Dr. Yu, I really appreciate you asking about my experience as a reader. And yeah. So let me begin by saying, I am well aware that as an upper middle class psi white male with multiple degrees now working on my doctorate of ministry, I come from an incredibly privileged place within these religious systems that I find myself a part of. Um, and so I also think as a white male reader, if I am not learning about the history of complicity that my ancestors were a part of, um, I am not doing my job in engaging colleagues of color here in the present day. So I really appreciated the way that you told these stories that invited me to think about um, my history and where I come from, right? I am a graduate of Columbia Seminary and Candler School of Theology. I lived in Atlanta for a decade. Yet at the same time, I think what we as readers and those of us from privileged places, if we can move to other ourselves, to learn about others and to be in different locations, that is how we learn best, right? So one of the things that I tell people is when I was an MDiv student at Columbia, I took Womanist Biblical Interpretation at ITC, right? And that was a wonderful experience of learning from people unlike me. So in so many ways, the history that you provide, Dr. Yoo, is an experience of othering myself because I do think I'm fairly progressive in theology and politics. And right, we're recording this on the day after President Trump's inauguration, right? And that's part of the historical setting that we find ourselves in today. And so I did find myself just weeping for the history that I am a part of at times, yet hopeful for what we can become as a church because of the way that you frame. And we'll get to the reckoning section here in a little bit. But so that's my experience. And yeah, as a reader of this wonderful book.
Oh, thanks, Bill. I do hope, perhaps my desire or
Yeah,
intent is not to evoke, and I write this in that last
yep,
chapter that you
yep,
briefly mentioned.
yep,
Um, it is for me not about guilt and shame
yep,
or privilege in and of
right,
itself, but it is about responsibility, repair, and to
yeah,
use a reformed understanding or theological
right,
concept,
yes,
illumination, that
yes,
we might be illumined,
yeah,
that to a pathway towards productive change.
yeah,
And again, I noted, and I found it several indigenous Christians and Black
mm,
Christians
yep,
in the book that I feature, that I read primary sources, their
yeah,
sermons, their
yep,
talks. William Apis, the
mm,
Pequot pastor from the early 19th century.
hmm,
He did note in one of his speeches in first in New Hampshire and then in Boston, Massachusetts, you and I are not guilty for our fathers. I'm going to use that gender
mm,
exclusive, just
yep,
quoting him,
yep,
before our ancestors' crimes. Perhaps I'll
mm,
adapt it that way.
yeah,
But we are responsible for the world and the church and nation that we've inherited.
yep,
So I do hope, and I understand in some ways where the guilt and the trauma comes from
yeah,
all across the board. It is a traumatic history. It
mm-hmm,
is a traumatic life that
mm,
indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans and later both free and enslaved African Americans lived.
yeah,
So it is good for us to confront that.
absolutely,
But it is also, I think, good for us to know it, to be informed, so
mm,
that we can get busy with
mm-hmm,
the work of repairing the world that we've inherited. So,
yeah,
with that, to your question
yeah,
about
yeah,
slavery, what surprised me?
yeah,
Bill, I can ask you, and I'll ask you this first. Sorry to put you on the spot. I'm turning
it's
the tables
okay,
some, right, Bill?
yeah,
Like, and I say it myself in the first chapter.
yep,
Like, I was surprised how little,
yeah,
as a educated person that I
yep,
am, how little I really knew about the history of slavery,
right,
both in the United States and in American
right,
Christianity. What about you? Like,
yeah,
how much did you know about
right,
slavery
so
before this book or other
minimally,
books?
Dr. Yu, right? So I my background is in music before I went into this. And so like part of this is like I was never a good historian. We had a 4 semester music history sequence in undergrad, and it took me 5 semesters to finish because I'm not good at history, right? So it really is like now at this point, working in my doctorate of ministry at Austin Seminary, I'm finally engaging scholarship at a level where I'm able to pay attention to it differently and personally, right? And so I while I've tried to read like Ibram X. Kendi and some of his work and indigenous people's history of the United States and scholarship like that, I am not well versed in this topic. So I appreciate the illumination that you are doing here with this wonderful book.
Oh yeah, thanks, Bill. So me too. I would say
Yeah,
we so I think for me it was the obviousness,
yeah,
and the bigness, if you will,
yep,
of the weight and the stakes of slavery
yeah,
that Americans living then in the
yep,
antebellum period,
yep,
particularly in the 1830s and on, as
yeah,
the abolitionist movement gained some traction, and
yep,
as even in the halls of Congress and in politics and everywhere you went, much of the engagement was about this thorny challenge of slavery and wrestling with the morality, the economics, the social and religious components of this. So I think perhaps what surprised me, and I think that would surprise many people, is the growth in intensity and fervor, but also just proliferation, even in terms of number of publications of the pro-slavery Christian movement.
Oh, interesting.
Right, Bill? On the one hand, it sounds like an oxymoron, just an obvious, glaring contradiction. You
Yeah.
mean to say there was this thing called pro-slavery Christianity?
Yeah.
Like these two words shouldn't go together,
Right.
yet they did.
Yeah.
And so, and it is, Bill, to say that, and I think in some of our minds, it is the idea that it was strong, like in the 1780s, let's say, 1790s, and increasingly over time, it like chipping away, like morality and goodness and abolitionist activism chipped away at it. But in fact, what I write about is that it's the inverse. That in fact, initially, slavery was not vigorously defended by Christian theologians and pastors.
Yeah.
It was accepted as a kind of quiet compromise.
Yeah.
It was, even to use their language of it, was a peculiar institution, which denotes and even implies we understand that this is not an obviously good institution, but it is the peculiar institution. And later, some Christian denominations, such as Presbyterians during the Civil War, even said that we have a peculiar mission to evangelize to our enslaved people. But it is actually the growth of it, that as abolitionists got more successful and gained more ears and eyes and attention, what that created was a necessity, sadly, for more robust pro-slavery Christian defenses. So long story short, Chris, and I write about it in the book that I hope many of your listeners will pick up, it is how, this is so ironic, but how good pro-slavery pastors got at defending slavery.
Yeah.
In terms of how good they got at finding like biblical passages and verses, and how good they got at refuting Christian abolitionist appeals and reasoning. They're going to appeal to the Golden Rule. They're going to appeal to Luke 4 and Jesus' call after he unrolls the scroll, quoted from Isaiah, to set free those who are captive, freedom for the oppressed. And how good, unfortunately, in such a bad, perverse way, pro-slavery pastors and theologians got at their craft of doing really this wicked, evil thing.
Yeah, Dr. Yoo, I think that's just such an important word for us today, especially as, you mentioned pro-slavery Christian being kind of oxymoronic. I think today, like thinking Christian nationalism, right? In a similar vein, like how do we hold on to some of these understandings of history and the movements that were going on, and what can we learn from them? Which in some ways, I'm answering this next question that I'm about to ask is like, what about this history do you think is most helpful for us to pay attention to today? Like, is it the resistance movement of abolitionism? Is it the way that folks were able to be in solidarity with people of color and indigenous peoples? What about the history can we grab today for our own selves and our own learnings as we live in this fraught moment of history?
Oh yeah, Bill, that's a great question. And I will probably also throw it back at you.
Yeah.
So let me start with
Yep.
I do think, and although I don't directly perhaps address this, although
Yep.
it is frequent, it is directly addressed, but it is not the central theme of the book. It is wrestling with Christian nationalism in the sense of it is wrestling with what does it mean to be patriotic?
Yeah.
What does it mean to belong to a nation and belong to a church or a faith?
Yep.
And how to do that well. And at one level, it is simple. It is to follow the greatest commandments, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself.
Yep.
But it is also for all of us wrestling with the challenge that national identity and nations are distinct from religious identities.
Yep.
So it is possible, and I find Samson Occam, the Mohegan pastor and first
Mm.
actually ordained
Yeah.
indigenous Protestant minister in Presbyterianism.
Yep.
I find in Frederick Douglass and
Mm.
James W.C. Pennington, both
Yep.
formerly enslaved Black men, Pennington becoming a Congregationalist and then Presbyterian minister. I do
Yep.
find in them holding to that in a productive tension,
Yeah.
to note that love of nation is a part of this side of heaven, if you will,
Yeah.
that we all belong to nations, that we
Yep.
don't live in a boundaryless, borderless world.
Yep.
We live in a world that is formed of nation states.
Yep.
And nation states cannot be entirely moral and ethical because
Yep.
they have economic and military and other interests.
Yep.
There's some self interest. So it is possible. How can one love one's nation but not
Mm.
turn that into an idol? This is what
Right.
Pennington argued, the Black
Yeah.
abolitionist in, I think, 1849.
Yeah.
So that, yes, we belong and we are American, but
Yeah.
we are also citizens of Christ with a
Mm.
higher calling that
Yeah.
will be able to test and refine and purify and
Yeah.
grow and sharpen our national identities. So
Yeah.
I don't think the answer is to say nationalism is entirely antithetical to the Christian gospel.
Mm.
You know
Mm.
what, Bill? Maybe
Yeah.
I can see perhaps there is a kind of abstract theological argument. You
Yep.
could make that
Yep.
case, but I don't think all of us living today can.
Yeah.
Like, I think
Mm.
about the Olympics, I think about the World Cup. We
Fair.
all have pride in our various nations, and we want them to win, and we're proud of the flag, and
Yeah.
we're proud when our
Yeah.
athletes are on that podium.
Yeah.
Um, and so I don't think it's to say like
Mm.
that's all wrong or selfish, but
Yeah.
I do think how does one blend and integrate and temper that,
Yeah.
the excesses of nationalism and civic idolatry
Yep.
with faith? So
Yep.
that's, I think, the point I would hope. That
Yeah.
one level, being an American Christian, it's easy. We
Yeah.
follow God, we love God, we do
Yep.
Micah 6:8, we
Yep.
walk just, we walk humbly, we do justice, love mercy, and the like.
Yep.
But another level, it is to say, not that it is impossible. All
Yep.
things are possible, but that it will require some tension,
Yeah.
productive tension. It will
Yeah.
require some dialogue. It will require some hard discernment. What
Yeah.
does it mean to be a faithful American Christian?
Yeah. So, Dr. Yu, this is so beautiful because, and what I love about us having this conversation today in late January of 2025, the next podcast series that I am in the process of recording now that will be released this spring is all about reconciliation. Right. And so, as we think about the multitude of ways that we need to be reconciled to God, ourselves, and one another today, both theologically and politically, I think this history that you lay out so deftly in this book just gives us language to have conversations about reconciliation. Again, because if we don't know the history, um, we are doomed to repeat it, right? And so I'd love to turn our conversation to this section on reckoning. That was, as a non-historian that tries to do history, was where I wanted to spend the most of my time. But I love the way you open this third section, Dr. Yu. You write that reckoning with history is not for the faint of heart. The past is powerful but dangerous because our origin stories reside there. You quote the German Protestant theologian Ernest Trollstadt that asserted in 1912 that the understanding of the present is always the final goal of history. And then you say that we are interested in history and study the past because we ultimately want to learn more about ourselves and how the world we inhabit came to be. And I just love that setup for this final section, right? And so you move us towards envisioning today's church, right? The title of this chapter is The Church That Never Was, But Still Could Be. And so I wonder, Dr. Yu, what gives you hope that we can learn from our past as we dream together about the future?
Oh, thanks, Bill. And thanks for reading part of my book to your listeners.
Yeah.
Um, I, I think it is possible,
Hmm.
and I write there also, I begin and end the book with this thought, that
Yeah.
it is possible, if not necessary, Bill, for
Yep.
us to be deeply honest and deeply hopeful
Yep.
about our past, present, and future.
Yep.
that it is to understand how we can talk, pray, worship, and work together
Hmm.
to be involved in growing our churches, but
Hmm.
also for our churches to be involved in growing local communities and ultimately the nation and the world.
Mm.
So perhaps in one way, um, like I hope, so I am a historian.
Yep.
I hope in writing books such as this and talking with leaders such as yourself,
Hmm.
maybe Bill, and I don't mean to say this
Yeah.
facetiously,
Yeah.
I want us to stop fighting about the past.
Mm.
I want us to
Yeah.
understand it in its
Yeah.
fullness. And I also
Yeah.
write in the book, sorry to keep talking about
Yeah.
that. It's like your readers, I owe them a quarter for every time I say in my book or about my book. But
Yeah. Yeah.
um, I say the fullness of history is both infuriating and inspiring.
Yep.
The injustice, as you talked about, is infuriating.
Yep.
The lead up to the Trail of Tears is simultaneously infuriating and inspiring.
Yeah.
Certainly, what is inspiring is that coalition of
Mm.
white missionaries and white pastors working
Yeah.
together with
Yeah.
various indigenous Christians of various indigenous nations
Yeah.
to really get involved. The first time white women got involved politically and organized together was to oppose the removal of the Cherokee in
Yeah.
my now state of Georgia.
Mm.
So
Mm.
there's a lot there. There's a lot that we can do.
Yep.
But it is to say, let's not fight about the past, but
Mm.
let's dialogue
Yep.
and wrestle
Yep.
and maybe not argue in the bad sense,
Yeah.
but like work together and even disagree sometimes
Sure.
at what we can do in the present and the future. I
Yeah.
would love for us to spend more time
Mm.
disagreeing about the present and the future.
Yeah.
Again, not because I'm looking for squabbles,
Yeah.
but to note here's the world, the church, the nation, the city, the county that we've inherited.
Yeah.
Let's disagree or let's agree. Let's talk about what we can do,
Yeah.
how we can be responsible Christians that are committed
Yep.
to justice and racial and other forms of repair.
Yeah.
That's the hope.
Dr. Yu, you just, yeah, you just, that's a good word for us to hear um, in early 2025. So thank you. I do think you are right that, and this is my hope that about theological education is that we come to a place of shared vocabulary so that we can have these disagreements without disparaging the other, right? That's my dream of reconciliation. That's my dream of what theological education does on its best day, and that's why I do what I do, raising money for our Presbyterian seminaries, right? It is because I have this hope about the future of the church in the world that we can be better than we are today. And so I am grateful for the way that you have laid out this history for us, for your call to the church to be present, and for the ways that you dream about its future. So thank you for this lovely conversation, Dr. Yu.
Oh, thank you, Bill. Thank you. So I can sense it
Yeah.
resonates with you. The idea that there is a productive tension and dialogue that's possible. But I
Right.
like how you said it. It
Right.
requires a shared vocabulary
Yeah.
and perhaps a shared, not like consciousness. We believe in
Right.
freedom of conscience,
Right.
but a
Yes.
shared understanding of
Yes.
the the challenges, the problems, the
Yes.
potential solutions,
Yes.
so that that is actually what one Christian says, here's how we should address poverty in our local
Hmm.
community as a church.
Hmm.
Another Christian says, no, I think this is how we should do it.
Right.
Right?
That's not
That's,
a bad thing,
yes,
right? If
that's
we're
right.
all working to alleviate poverty and systems of injustice, we have learned from our past at that point and have hope for the future. Um, we just need a shared vocabulary, I think. And so I am grateful for the ways that this book contributes to that shared vocabulary by helping us understand our past. And I'm grateful for you, Dr. Yu. So I do have one more question because here during this inauguration week, we hear lots of different things in our lives. And this is a question that I ask all of my guests, right? So whether it be sermon, podcast, music, TED Talk, lecture, Dr. Yu, what is the best thing that you have heard lately?
Oh, yeah, thanks, Bill. I guess what I want to shout out
Yeah,
are the podcasts and sermons
yeah,
that come from everyday Presbyterian
mm,
clergy.
yeah,
I think this is crucial with
yeah,
pastors Charlene Hahn Powell and Amos
mm,
DeSasa.
yeah,
I think I hear wonderful sermons now with the access of it. I'll shout
yeah,
out Betsy Sweetenberg at Northridge
mm,
Presbyterian in Dallas,
yeah,
David Lewicki in my backyard right here in
yep,
Decatur, Georgia at North Decatur Presbyterian. But I just want to celebrate
yeah,
that with access, your podcast too,
yeah.
Reverend Bill Davis,
Thank
that
you, Dr.
I
Yu.
want to, there Presbyterian clergy and pastors and preachers
Yeah,
who are in it
yeah,
with people of faith in the pews and working together. I
yeah,
just think there's so much wisdom in
mm,
hearing them talk in ways that are both prophetic and pastoral,
yeah,
that are deep and honest and loving
yeah,
about all of the hard uncertainty that is happening in our church, nation, and world today.
yeah.
So I would say listen to a good Presbyterian pastor, and you have an ample like choice.
Amen. Amen. There is an abundance of riches right now for our listeners to engage with as they deepen their own faith and as they listen to the good stuff out there. So, Dr. Yu, thank you for shouting out all those good colleagues in ministry. Friends, I am incredibly grateful for you taking time to listen to this conversation with me and Professor William Yoo. Reading Theologically is a ministry of the Presbyterian Foundation, today in partnership with Westminster John Knox Books and the Presbyterian Publishing Corporation, who were so gracious in providing me an advance copy of Dr. Yu's newest book. Go read it, learn from it, have opinions about it so that you can engage your faith in this world more fully today. Dr. Yu, thank you for joining us, and friends, we'll be back with another episode soon. Peace and blessings.